Halfland, an ahistorical prehistory. The Battle of Gresnik's Cut. In the 103rd year of the Common Reckoning, Alberus Dogface, the ruler of Dogopolis, mustered an army and marched it into the Goblin Downs, seeking retribution for the depredations inflicted by the goblins upon his subjects. All of the free citizens of Dogopolis were eligible for military service and were required to own a sword and shield for this purpose. The wealthier citizens were expected in addition to provide themselves with full armour and fight as heavy infantry, while those less well off would fight unarmoured. The territory of Dogopolis was divided into geographical areas, each of which was assessed as being able to provide a specified number of troops of each type to Alberos upon request. Once troops from all these areas had been assembled, then, for ease of command and administration, they were divided into cohorts of 100 men. For this punitive expedition against the goblins, Alberos levied men sufficient to form 4 cohorts, that is to say, 400 men. While this was only a part of the total number of troops potentially available to him, he considered it to be adequate to the purpose in hand. The force included 2 cohorts of light infantrymen, one of which consisted of javelin men and the other of slingers. There were also 2 cohorts of armoured infantry, carrying heavy throwing spears. Finally, Alberos was accompanied by his own personal bodyguard of 60 well-trained and well-armoured spearmen. Alberos and his army ascended into the hills by way of a pleasant valley, carved by a gurgling river, fed by the copious precipitation that routinely watered the uplands looming before them. At its foot the valley was heavily wooded, but as the men ascended the landscape changed to bare moorland, with only the occasional clump of trees here and there, clinging precariously to the slopes on either side. They marched with the river to their right. The cohort of slingers was positioned in front, followed by a cohort of heavy infantry. Behind them came Alberos and his bodyguard, with the second cohort of heavy infantry bringing up the rear. The javelin-men formed a protective screen to the left of the army, the right being protected by the river. The sun beat down on the sweating soldiers as they wearily trudged up the silent and apparently deserted valley. But the valley was not deserted. Gresnik was waiting for them. Gresnik was a goblin and a famous warrior, or at least an accomplished cattle raider. This was sufficient to give him a high standing among his fellow goblins. Many heeded him when he urged them to proactively attack Alberos' army before it could do them any harm, rather than wait for their villages to be burned and their families slaughtered. Some 650 goblins flocked to his standard. Most of these goblins were not particularly well equipped, nor experienced at war. Some 300 of them were unarmoured archers, armed only with hunting bows and axes that were designed to chop wood, not men. Gresnik arranged these archers into 3 companies. About half of the remaining goblins also had no armour. Many of these were simply equipped with rudimentary spears, which they used two-handedly, but some had shields, which they used with their axes. That left just over 150 experienced fighting goblins, armoured and wielding either 2-handed war axes or carrying a shield and wielding a 1-handed weapon of war. The valley that Alberos was now ascending was well known to the goblins, who referred to it as the Cut. Gresnik had often used this route, travelling down to the lowlands and then returning, driving herds of liberated cattle before him. He knew that this was the perfect site to ambush the Dogopolitans, and had arrayed his forces on the valley sides, concealed in patches of woodland, or hidden behind areas of higher ground. Unsuspecting, Alboros marched his men up the valley, and then the silence was broken. Drums started to beat, echoing, reverberating between the hillsides. Goblin archers appeared on the heights to the Doggerpolitan's left, while on the far bank of the river more archers emerged from the patches of trees clinging to the valley sides. The drums beat once, and the goblin archers nocked their arrows. They beat again, and goblin bows were raised and drawn. And then, on the third drum beat, the arrows were loosed, raining down upon the Doggerpolitans. Although surprised, Alboros reacted quickly. He ordered his slingers to wheel to their right, to engage the archers on the far side of the river. Then, turning to his left flank, he ordered his javelin men to ascend the slopes above them and deal with the archers stationed there. The exchange of missiles over the river between the goblin archers and the Doggerpolitan slingers did not go well for the Doggerpolitans. Several of the slingers fell, and seeing this, about half of the remaining slingers retreated back down the valley in disarray. Alboros cursed. It seemed that the goblin archers to his right would have to be dealt with using cold steel at close quarters. To this purpose, he ordered the cohort of heavy infantry at the rear of his column to wade over the river. The goblin archers switched their aim to this new threat, and the river ran red with Doggerpolitan blood. And then a horn sounded from the head of the valley. There was a moment's silence, and then, from a patch of woodland to the Doggerpolitan's left rear, a great shout was heard in response. And from that woodland emerged a horde of screaming goblins, charging down the hillside. Gresnik had unleashed his light infantry, seeking to cut off any Doggerpolitan retreat. And even as Alboros considered the implications of this, the horn sounded again, and the goblin heavy infantry, led by Gresnik himself, emerged from a stand of trees at the head of the valley. But still, Alboros kept calm. He now realized that he was in something of a predicament, and that he needed to extricate his army from the trap it had marched into. He ordered his leading cohort of heavy infantry to advance toward the goblin heavy infantry, trying to hold them at bay. This would give him time to deal with the goblin light infantry, and so open a line of retreat. He summoned all available forces to this end, leading his spearmen toward the charging light infantry, recalling his javelin men back down the hill, and his second cohort of heavy infantry back from the river. The goblin light infantry was not dismayed by the sight of all these troops advancing toward them. Quite the contrary. The bulk of the goblins charged into Alboros and his spearmen, while a smaller group turned aside and charged the javelin men. At the head of the column, the slingers who had previously retreated had been cajoled and threatened by their officers and persuaded to rejoin their companions. And this addition to the ranks of the slingers had an immediate impact, as the goblin archers on the far bank of the river now started to fall. And things were also looking up for Alboros at the rear of the column, as his spearmen stood firm against the charge of the goblin light infantry, spitting a number of them on Doggerpolitan spears, and driving many others back in confusion. But this upturn in Alboros' fortunes was short-lived. Even as the leading cohort of Doggerpolitan heavy infantry formed up to face Gresnik and his warriors, the goblin archers on the hillside to their left poured arrows into them with lethal effect. The survivors turned and fled down the valley. Gresnik and his heavy infantry jeered at their fleeing foes and advanced toward the Doggerpolitan slingers who, for the moment, were standing their ground. Meanwhile, at the rear of the column, Alboros and his spearmen had been joined by those of the second cohort of Doggerpolitan heavy infantry that were not floating lifeless down the river, pierced with goblin arrows. Despite suffering some casualties in the process, this combined force managed to clear a path through the goblin light infantry facing it, and Alboros and a group of his soldiers burst through this breach, heading back downstream. And, seeing their leader withdrawing from the field, Doggerpolitan discipline began to break, and the rest of Alboros' army followed him, fleeing in disarray. The goblins contented themselves with hurling arrows and abuse after them, and thus ended the fight that was afterwards known as the Battle of Gresnik's Cut.